Fisherman saves millionaire's daughter in a storm. What the millionaire does next shocks the whole village. The waves rolled endlessly against the shore of Port Harbor, their rhythmic crash against the rocks a sound that had become both comforting and menacing to Daniel Hartley. He stood barefoot on the creaking dock, staring out at the horizon where dark clouds loomed. The smell of salt and seaweed clung to the air, mingling with the faint odor of diesel from his battered fishing boat, the mariner's hope. For Daniel, the sea was both a lifeline and a curse. It was all he had known since childhood, taught by his father, who had learned from his father before him. The ocean had given the Hartleys their living for generations, but in recent years, it seemed to take more than it gave. The once thriving fishing industry in Port Harbor had dwindled to almost nothing. Larger commercial fleets had overfished the waters, leaving little for the small-time fishermen who called the village home. Now, only a handful of boats remained, their owners eking out a living with meager catches and even slimmer hopes. Daniel's boat was one of the last still active. It groaned under the weight of time, the wood splintering in places and the engine sputtering on its best days. He spent more time patching leaks and repairing nets than he did catching fish. He didn't complain, though. He couldn't afford to. Life at home wasn't much easier. Daniel's wife, Lily, worked tirelessly to stretch every penny he brought in. She sold baked goods at the local market, her hands often raw from kneading dough. Their 8-year-old son, Jamie, was a bright spot of joy in their lives, but even he was starting to understand the weight of their struggles. "Papa, why don't we just get a bigger boat like Mr. Wilkes?" Jamie had asked one evening, his innocent question cutting like a knife. Daniel had forced a smile. "Because Mr. Wilkes has big bills to pay for that big boat," he replied, ruffling Jamie's hair. "We're doing just fine with what we've got." But that wasn't true. The truth was, the family was barely scraping by. The mortgage on their modest cottage was months overdue, and Daniel was behind on payments for the fuel and supplies he needed to keep fishing. He often lay awake at night, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how long they could hold on. That night, a storm began brewing. The sky turned an ominous gray, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows of their cottage. Daniel, restless as ever, walked to the dock to secure his boat. The storm was one of the worst he'd seen in years. Rain lashed against his face as he tightened the ropes, the wind howling like a wild beast. He muttered a silent prayer that the mariner's hope would survive the night. Just as he finished securing the last knot, something caught his attention. A flash of movement on the water. At first, he thought it was driftwood or debris thrown about by the storm, but then he saw it again. A figure flailing in the water, struggling against the violent waves. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. It wasn't debris. It was a person. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed the life preserver from his boat and tied a length of rope around his waist. He secured the other end to the dock, knowing full well the risk he was about to take. "Hold on," he shouted, though his voice was swallowed by the storm. The icy water hit him like a wall as he dove in, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He fought the current with powerful strokes, his eyes locked on the figure drifting dangerously close to the jagged rocks. As he got closer, he realized it was a young woman. Her arms flailed weakly, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. "I'm coming!" Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse. He reached her just as she began to sink. Wrapping an arm around her waist, he slipped the preserver over her shoulders. "You're okay," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. The current was relentless, dragging them toward the rocks. Daniel kicked furiously, every muscle in his body burning as he fought to pull them back toward the dock. The rope tied to his waist tugged him back inch by inch, but it was slow, grueling work. The storm didn't let up, and the waves seemed determined to tear them apart. Daniel's grip on the girl tightened as he pushed through the water, refusing to let her go. When he finally reached the dock, his strength was nearly gone. With one last effort, he hoisted her onto the platform, collapsing beside her in a heap. The girl coughed violently, water streaming from her mouth as she gasped for air. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her eyes were wide with shock. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling with exhaustion. She nodded weakly, her body shaking from the cold. Daniel pulled off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "We need to get you inside," he said, helping her to her feet. Together, they staggered toward the warmth of his cottage, the storm still raging behind them. The storm continued to batter the small fishing village, rattling windows and howling through the cracks in the cottage walls. Inside, Lily Hartley moved quickly, wrapping the drenched young woman in a thick blanket and pressing a steaming cup of tea into her trembling hands. "Here, love," Lily said softly. "This will warm you up." Daniel, still soaked to the bone, sat by the fire, his muscles aching from the rescue. His wife cast him a worried glance. "You're going to catch your death out there one of these days," she muttered, though her voice carried relief that he'd come back alive. The girl on the couch clutched the mug tightly, her hands still shaking. Her dark hair, wet and tangled, clung to her pale face, and her wide, terrified eyes darted around the small room. "What's your name?" Lily asked gently, crouching beside her. "Isabel," the girl whispered, her voice hoarse. "And what on earth were you doing out there in a storm like this?" Lily pressed, her tone kind but firm. Isabel hesitated, her lips trembling. I was on a yacht with my father and some of his friends," she said finally. "The storm came out of nowhere. I went to the deck to get some air and I slipped. No one saw me fall." Her voice broke on the last word, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was going to die." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Well, you're safe now," he said. "That's what matters." Lily placed a hand on Isabel's shoulder. "Your father must be worried sick. We should contact him." Isabel nodded weakly, but she seemed hesitant. "What's your father's name?" Daniel asked, sensing her reluctance. She hesitated again before mumbling, "Edward Thatcher." Daniel blinked. "Thatcher? As in the Edward Thatcher, the real estate tycoon?" Isabel nodded, looking down at the mug in her hands. Lily gasped softly. "Good heavens, child! Your father's one of the wealthiest men in the world. What's he doing here in Port Harbor?" Isabel glanced up, her expression conflicted. "He's been scouting locations for a new project," she said. "Something about luxury waterfront properties." Daniel's jaw tightened at the mention of luxury properties. It was no secret in the village that developers had been eyeing the coastline, whispering promises of upscale resorts and private marinas. For fishermen like Daniel, it felt like yet another threat to their livelihood. A loud knock at the door interrupted the tense moment. Daniel rose cautiously, opening it to find two men standing in the rain, their expensive suits drenched. "Isabel!" one of them exclaimed, relief flooding his face as he spotted her on the couch. The other man, taller and more composed, stepped forward. "We've been searching everywhere," he said. "Mr. Thatcher will be relieved to know you're safe." "You're not taking her anywhere in this storm," Daniel said firmly, blocking the doorway. The taller man frowned. "With all due respect, sir, she needs to be returned to her father immediately." "She needs rest," Daniel shot back. "She's been through enough tonight." You can tell Mr. Thatcher she's safe, but she's staying here until the storm passes." The man hesitated, but seemed to recognize there was no room for argument. "Very well," he said, "but we'll stay close by." They left, reluctantly, standing watch in their vehicle down the road. That night, after Isabel had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the couch, Daniel and Lily sat by the fire, speaking in hushed tones. "Do you think her father will show up himself?" Lily asked, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "Hard to say," Daniel replied, staring into the flames. "Men like Edward Thatcher don't come down to places like this unless they have to. But if he does, I'll have a thing or two to say about his luxury properties." Lily gave him a look. "Don't go stirring trouble, Daniel. That man could probably buy this whole village if he wanted to." "That's what I'm afraid of," Daniel muttered. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving the village drenched and quiet. The air was crisp and cold, and the sea was eerily calm. A sleek black car pulled up to the Hartleys' cottage, its tires crunching on the gravel. Daniel stepped outside as the door opened, and a tall, imposing man emerged. His tailored suit was immaculate, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the cottage with quiet intensity. Edward Thatcher. The billionaire's presence seemed to radiate authority, and for a moment, Daniel felt like a small fish in a very large pond. But he straightened his back, refusing to let himself be intimidated. "Are you the man who saved my daughter?" Edward asked, his voice low and commanding. "I am," Daniel replied simply. Edward studied him for a moment before extending a hand. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere. "I owe you more than I can say." Daniel shook his hand, his grip firm. "She's safe. That's all that matters." Edward's gaze shifted toward the cottage. "May I see her?" Daniel nodded reluctantly, stepping aside to let the billionaire enter. Inside, Isabel's face lit up when she saw her father. "Dad!" she cried, running to embrace him. Edward held her tightly, his composed demeanor breaking for just a moment. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As the morning unfolded, Edward thanked the Hartleys repeatedly, offering money for their kindness. But Daniel refused. "I didn't do it for money," he said firmly. Edward nodded, though he seemed thoughtful. "I understand. But perhaps there's another way I can repay you. Something more meaningful." Daniel raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to make of the offer. The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the Hartleys' cottage, its polished exterior gleaming under the bright sunlight. Daniel watched warily from the porch as Edward Thatcher stepped out, his tailored suit impeccable despite the rustic surroundings. He wasn't alone. Isabel was with him, her face glowing with relief now that the storm had passed. "I'd like to invite you and your family to my home," Edward said, his voice calm but commanding. "There's much to discuss, and I'd rather do it where we're more comfortable." Daniel hesitated, glancing at Lily, who had come to the door with Jamie peeking around her legs. It wasn't every day a man like Edward Thatcher made an invitation like this, but the unspoken weight of his gratitude pushed Daniel to agree. "All right," Daniel said, his voice measured. "Lead the way." The drive to Edward's home was a stark reminder of the distance between their worlds. His estate was a sprawling mansion perched on a hill overlooking the coast, its modern architecture framed by manicured gardens and fountains. As they drove up the long driveway, Daniel couldn't help but feel out of place. Inside, the house was even more breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the sleek, minimalist interior in natural light. Expensive artwork adorned the walls, and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. A butler escorted them to a sunlit sitting room, where Edward invited them to sit on a plush leather sofa. Isabel stayed close to her father, but her warm smile reassured Lily and Jamie, who were visibly awestruck by their surroundings. Edward leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Daniel. "Mr. Hartley, I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my daughter's life, and I want to show you how much that means to me." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct praise. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said. "I just did what anyone would have done." Edward smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but not everyone would risk their life in a storm like that. Your bravery saved Isabel, and for that, I'm grateful." He paused, his expression turning thoughtful. "But I want to do more than just thank you. I've been looking at this village closely over the past few weeks. The fishing industry is struggling, and the community is barely holding on. I believe we can do something about that." Daniel's brow furrowed. "And how exactly do you plan to help?" Edward gestured toward a stack of blueprints on the coffee table. "I was scouting this area for a luxury waterfront development," he admitted. "But after meeting you and seeing what this village means to its people, I've decided to shift my focus. Instead of building resorts that would displace the locals, I want to invest in the community, repair the docks, fund new boats, and create opportunities that benefit everyone." Daniel stared at him, his skepticism evident. "And what's in it for you?" Edward chuckled softly. "You're a sharp man, Mr. Hartley. Let's just say I've made enough money in my life. This isn't about profit. It's about creating something meaningful. I've realized that legacy isn't just about wealth. It's about the impact you leave behind." The Hartleys spent the afternoon discussing Edward's vision. He explained his plans in detail, showing them sketches of proposed improvements to the village infrastructure, including a marketplace for fishermen to sell their catch directly to buyers. "It's ambitious," Lily admitted, sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup. "But it sounds wonderful. If you're serious about this, it could change everything." "I am serious," Edward said, his tone resolute. "But I'll need the support of the locals to make it work. And I'd like you, Mr. Hartley, to be my liaison. You know this village better than I ever could, and I trust your judgment." Daniel hesitated, the weight of the offer settling heavily on his shoulders. He looked at Lily, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "All right," he said finally. "I'll help." As the afternoon wore on, Edward invited the Hartleys to explore his estate. Jamie was particularly taken with the sprawling gardens, while Lily marveled at the art collection. Isabel, meanwhile, spent time chatting with Daniel, asking about his life as a fisherman and the challenges he faced. But as the sun began to set, Edward's head of security entered the room with a grim expression. "Mr. Thatcher, there's something you need to know," he said, lowering his voice. Edward excused himself, stepping into the hallway. The conversation was brief, but left Edward's jaw tight with tension when he returned. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, his instincts telling him trouble was brewing. Edward exhaled, his gaze sharp. "We've had some trouble at the dock site. A group of men, likely from a rival development firm, has been causing disruptions. They're trying to sabotage the progress we've made." Daniel's expression hardened. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing for now," Edward said. "I'll handle it. But this won't be the last time we face resistance. Not everyone wants to see this project succeed." That evening, as the Hartleys returned to their cottage, Daniel couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. Edward's vision was promising, but the challenges ahead were becoming clearer. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Daniel resolved to see it through. The village needed this, and for the first time in years, he had hoped that Port Harbor's future might be brighter than its past. The following morning, Daniel rose before dawn, as was his habit. The salty breeze carried the faint promise of a clear day, but he felt the weight of Edward's warnings from the night before. Rival developers interfering with the docks didn't sit right with him, and he had a nagging sense that the trouble was far from over. By the time Daniel reached the docks, Edward was already there. The billionaire stood near a group of workers, his sharp suit replaced by a simple jacket and sturdy boots, blending in far better than Daniel would have expected. "Morning," Edward greeted, his tone brisk but cordial. "Morning," Daniel replied, joining him. "Any sign of those men you mentioned?" Edward shook his head. "Not yet, but I've doubled the security presence just in case. I won't let anyone derail this project." Daniel glanced at the workers hauling supplies to the site, their faces tense but determined. The docks were abuzz with activity. Construction crews reinforcing the old wooden planks, fishermen preparing their boats, and planners discussing layouts for the new market stalls. It felt like hope in motion, but the shadow of opposition lingered in the air. Later that afternoon, the peace was shattered. Daniel was helping unload lumber when a commotion erupted at the far end of the docks. Shouts rang out, and a group of unfamiliar men appeared, their rough demeanor and aggressive posturing immediately setting everyone on edge. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, his voice booming. "This project is a waste of time and money. You're tearing up these docks for nothing." Edward strode toward the group, his expression calm but unyielding. "I don't know who you are, but you're trespassing on private property. Leave now, or I'll have the authorities deal with you." The man sneered. "You think your money makes you untouchable, Thatcher? We'll see about that." Before Edward could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "You heard the man. Get out of here," he said, his voice steady but firm. The intruders glared at him, but the intensity in Daniel's eyes was enough to make them hesitate. After a tense standoff, the men retreated, but their parting words carried a warning. "This isn't over," the leader spat before disappearing into the crowd. The incident left the entire team on edge. That evening, Edward called an emergency meeting at the docks, gathering the workers, fishermen, and village leaders to address the situation. "This project is about more than just new docks and markets," Edward said, his voice strong and unwavering. "It's about giving this community a chance to thrive again. But we're facing opposition from people who don't want to see that happen. They'll try to intimidate us, but we can't let them win." Daniel stood beside him, his arms crossed. "We've fought storms and hardships before," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his years at sea. "We're not about to back down now." The crowd murmured their agreement, their resolve hardening. A few days later, the threats escalated. One night, Daniel was awakened by the sound of shouting and the faint smell of smoke. He rushed to the docks to find one of the storage sheds ablaze, the flames casting an eerie glow against the dark sky. Firefighters arrived quickly, but the damage was done. The shed, which had housed supplies for the market construction, was completely destroyed. Edward arrived moments later, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his voice tight with anger. "It's more than that," Daniel said. "They're trying to shut us down." "What's the plan now?" Edward's jaw tightened. "We rebuild, stronger than before." Despite the setbacks, the project pressed on. The workers doubled their efforts, and Edward personally financed additional security measures. He also took steps to reach out to the villagers, hosting community forums to ensure their voices were heard. At one of these forums, a young fisherman named Sam stood up, his voice filled with emotion. "I've spent my whole life watching this village decline," he said, "but now, for the first time, I feel like we have a future. Thank you, Mr. Thatcher, for believing in us." Edward nodded, his expression softening. "It's not just me," he said. "This is a team effort. People like Daniel have been the backbone of this community for years. I'm just helping to amplify what was already here." The villagers applauded, their faith in the project growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as Daniel and Edward walked along the nearly completed docks, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Edward turned to his companion. "I meant what I said earlier," Edward began. "This is a team effort, and I couldn't have done it without you." Daniel shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You gave us hope, Edward. That's what made the difference." Edward smiled faintly. "Hope is important, but so is action. And you've proven time and again that you're willing to take action. That's why I want you to think about something." "What's that?" Daniel asked, glancing at him. "I want you to take on a leadership role in this project. Not just for now, but for the long term. You know this village better than anyone, and your voice carries weight here." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Edward said. "This village doesn't just need investors. It needs leaders who care about its future. And I can't think of anyone better suited for the job than you." As Daniel mulled over the offer, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. He had spent so long fighting just to survive that the idea of thriving, of making a real difference, seemed almost unreal. But as he looked out at the bustling docks, now alive with activity and hope, he realized that this was more than just a project. It was a new beginning. The development project at Port Harbor was finally complete. The once crumbling docks now stood strong and bustling with life. The new marketplace, adorned with colorful stalls, was filled with fresh catches, baked goods, and crafts made by the locals. Boats bobbed cheerfully in the harbor, and the sound of laughter and business filled the air. Edward Thatcher had kept every promise he made. He had invested not only in the infrastructure, but also in the people, ensuring that the village could thrive for generations to come. For Daniel Hartley, it felt like a dream come true. His once fragile hope for Port Harbor had grown into something tangible, something lasting. One evening, the village held a celebration to mark the success of the project. Lanterns lined the docks, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Edward stood on a raised platform, addressing the crowd with his usual commanding presence. "This project started as an idea," he said, his voice filled with pride. "But it became a testament to the resilience of this community. I'm honored to have been a part of it." He turned toward Daniel, who stood nearby. "And none of it would have been possible without this man. Daniel Hartley is the heart of Port Harbor, and I couldn't have asked for a better partner." The crowd erupted in applause, and Daniel felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. But as Edward stepped down from the platform, something was off. His hand clutched his chest, and his face twisted in pain. "Edward?" Daniel said, rushing forward. Edward stumbled, his knees buckling. Daniel caught him just before he hit the ground. "Call an ambulance!" Daniel shouted, panic gripping him. Edward was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical. The diagnosis was a severe heart attack, and the doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him. Daniel and Isabel sat in the waiting room, their faces pale and their hands trembling. "He's going to be okay," Isabel said, as if trying to convince herself. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's strong. If anyone can pull through this, it's him." Hours later, a doctor emerged with an update. Edward was stable, but would require extensive rest and recovery. His days of running a business empire were over. A week later, Edward called Daniel to his bedside. Isabel was with him, her eyes red from sleepless nights. Edward's face was pale, his once commanding presence now subdued. "Daniel," Edward began, his voice weak but steady, "I've made arrangements. The company, it's yours now." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" "I've been thinking about this for a while," Edward said, pausing to catch his breath. "You've shown me that you're more than capable. You understand people, you understand hard work, and most importantly, you care. The company needs someone like you to lead it." "But, Edward, Edward held up a hand to silence him. "You saved my daughter, Daniel. You saved this village. And now, I need you to take what we've built here and make it even better." Daniel sat back, stunned. "This is too much. I'm just a fisherman." "No," Edward said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're a leader, and Isabel will be by your side. She knows the business, and together, I know you'll do great things." Isabel nodded, her expression filled with determination. "I'll help in any way I can," she said. The transition was swift. With Edward stepping down, Daniel found himself at the helm of a vast company he barely understood. It was daunting, but Isabel became his guide, walking him through every aspect of the business. At first, there were challenges. Board members questioned his leadership, and Daniel struggled to navigate the complexities of the corporate world. But his honesty, resilience, and dedication quickly won people over. He kept Edward's vision alive, focusing on sustainable development that benefited communities rather than exploiting them. He expanded the company's reach, using its resources to uplift struggling areas like Port Harbor. Back in the village, Daniel didn't forget his roots. He continued to live modestly, ensuring that the people of Port Harbor thrived alongside the company's success. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his new office, Isabel joined him. "You're doing a great job," she said, her voice warm. Daniel chuckled. "I still feel like I'm figuring it out." She smiled. "You've got a good heart, Daniel. That's what matters." He looked out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars. "I just hope Edward's proud." "He is," Isabel said softly. "And so am I." A year had passed since Daniel Hartley took the reins of Edward Thatcher's company, and life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. Under his leadership, the company had flourished, not just financially, but morally. Projects focused on community-driven development had become the heart of the business, with profits reinvested into rebuilding towns, improving infrastructure, and providing opportunities for those who needed them most. Port Harbor had become a shining example of what was possible when people worked together for a common goal. The docks thrived with activity, the marketplace bustled with life, and the village itself seemed to radiate hope. Daniel, once a humble fisherman struggling to make ends meet, now found himself at the head of a company that touched lives far beyond the village he called home. But he hadn't forgotten his roots. One sunny afternoon, Daniel walked along the docks, his boots thudding softly against the wood. Jamie trotted beside him, carrying a bundle of fishing nets. "Papa," Jamie said, his voice full of excitement, "do you think we'll catch something big today?" Daniel smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "We'll see. But remember, it's not always about the size of the catch. It's about enjoying the day." Nearby, Isabel stood at the marketplace, talking with vendors and helping organize new stalls. She had found her own niche within the company, overseeing the community outreach initiatives that had become its hallmark. Her sharp business acumen and genuine care for people made her a natural leader, and her bond with Daniel had only grown stronger over the past year. As Daniel approached, Isabel turned and waved. "There you are. I was just telling Mrs. Weaver that you'd be joining the fishing tournament this weekend," Daniel laughed. "You've got me booked for everything these days, don't you?" "It's good for morale," Isabel replied with a grin. That evening, the village gathered for a celebration marking the anniversary of the project's completion. Lanterns lit the docks, and tables overflowed with fresh seafood, baked goods, and handmade crafts. Children ran around laughing, while the adults mingled, their faces glowing with contentment. Daniel stood near the edge of the gathering, watching the scene with a deep sense of pride. Isabel joined him, holding a glass of lemonade. "You've done incredible things, Daniel," she said softly. "My father would be so proud." Daniel's throat tightened at her words. "I couldn't have done it without you, Isabel. Or him." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "He always believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I hope I'm honoring his legacy." "You are," Isabel said firmly. "And you're building your own in the process." The evening culminated with a speech from Daniel, who stood atop a makeshift stage as the crowd gathered around him. "When this all began," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I never imagined I'd be standing here today. I was just a fisherman trying to get by, doing my best for my family. But one act of kindness, a moment when I simply did what felt right, changed everything." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "This village is more than just a place to live. It's a reminder of what we can achieve when we come together. Edward Thatcher gave us the tools, but it was all of you, your hard work, your belief, that made this possible." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Daniel stepped down, his heart full. Later that night, as the celebration wound down, Daniel found himself sitting by the water's edge, looking out at the moonlit waves. Isabel sat beside him, her presence quiet but comforting. "You know," she said after a long silence, "I think my father found peace in the end. Because of you." Daniel glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "He used to worry that everything he built would mean nothing," she continued. "But you gave it purpose. You showed him that what he created could do real good." Daniel nodded, his chest tightening. "And you've helped make it happen, Isabel. I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. "We make a good team?" A year after Edward's heart attack, his legacy had not only survived, but thrived. Under Daniel's leadership, and with Isabel's unwavering support, the company had transformed into a beacon of hope for countless communities. For Daniel, it was more than just a job. It was a calling. And for Isabel, it was a way to honor her father while building something of her own. Together, they carried forward the spirit of Edward Thatcher, proving that one act of kindness could ripple outward and change the world. Did this heartwarming story inspire you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What moved you the most about Daniel's journey? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore more uplifting stories about courage, transformation, and the power of kindness. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you next time for another unforgettable story.